All right, so let's jump right into it today with some economic news that, well, honestly, might be making some of you feel a little uncertain about the future.
Yeah, for sure. It can definitely feel like a lot to process right now.
Totally.
Hmm.
So the Fed, they just decided to hit the pause button on lowering interest rates.
Right?
But at the same time, inflation, it's still kind of looming out there as a concern. And we're going to break down what this means for you and how this connects to some other big stories that are making headlines right now.
Okay. Sounds good.
So we've got three sources that we're looking at today.
Mm.
First, we have a Money Watch article about the Fed's decision.
Okay.
We also have an excerpt about the potential effects of Trump's tariffs on car prices in the U.S.
Interesting.
And then finally, a CNN article that covers a really tense Oval Office meeting between Trump and the Ukrainian President Zelenskyy.
Okay, so three pretty big topics there.
Yeah, and the goal here is, by sticking with us, you'll start to see how these seemingly separate pieces actually create like a bigger picture of what's happening in our world right now.
Yeah, I think it's so easy to get caught up in the day-to-day headlines and miss those bigger connections.
For sure. So let's start with the Fed.
Okay.
So, they're keeping those interest rates steady for the moment, but it seems like a really tough decision to make.
Yeah, it is.
What is the risk if inflation creeps higher than that 2% target that we always hear them talking about?
Well, that 2%, it isn't just some random number the Fed pulled out of thin air.
Right.
It's all about stability. If inflation starts getting way too high, it erodes the value of your savings. And it can lead to a situation where, those prices just spiral out of control.
Yeah, I can imagine.
I mean, think about it like going to the grocery store and your usual, basket of stuff suddenly costs 10% more or 20%, even 30% more.
Oh, yeah. No, thank you.
Yeah, that's the kind of scary scenario the Fed is trying to prevent.
Totally makes sense. And speaking of things I don't want to pay more for, with those interest rates staying put for now,
Yeah.
does that mean that things like credit card interest or mortgage rates are going to stay high too?
It is definitely something to think about, especially when you see things like our Money Watch article pointing out those rising delinquencies on credit card and auto loans.
Oh, wow.
It's a trend that's really hitting those lower and middle income households hard. And Joe Gafolio, the CEO of Mutual of America Capital Management,
Okay.
he points out that, even those small changes in interest rates, they can really have a big ripple effect on people's everyday lives.
For sure. And, this is where I think things start to get even more complicated
Okay.
because now we have to start factoring in those tariffs that Trump's been talking about.
Right.
Could this whole trade war be part of the reason the Fed is so hesitant to lower those rates?
That's definitely a possibility and a big piece of the puzzle here.
Okay.
So remember, tariffs are essentially taxes on imported goods. And that excerpt we have, it really focuses on the auto industry, which, as we all know, relies on these really complex global supply chains.
Yeah, for sure.
The report says adding those tariffs could potentially tack on an extra, get this, $5,790 to the price of a new car.
$5,790. Wow. That's not jump change.
No, definitely not. And if those car prices go up, well, that can feed into overall inflation.
Right.
It's like adding fuel to the fire that the Fed's trying to control.
Yeah, and speaking of feeling the heat, it sounds like even companies as big as Ford are worried about all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. Ford's CEO, Jim Farley, he described the whole situation as cost and chaos.
Oh, wow.
So you have those higher prices for consumers on one side,
Right.
but then you also have all these businesses dealing with those increasing expenses and unpredictable supply chains. It
Yeah.
just makes for a very uncertain environment for everyone involved.
Okay, so let's do a quick recap here.
All right.
We've got rising inflation, a Fed that's afraid to lower rates tariffs, potentially pushing prices up even higher.
Yeah, that about sums it up.
Now, I want to bring in this CNN article about Trump's meeting with Zelenskyy, the Ukrainian president.
Okay.
This article describes some pretty tense moments.
Mm-hmm.
Zelenskyy was accused of being ungrateful for the U.S. support.
Ah, I read that.
And honestly, this just feels like a whole other layer of complexity getting added to everything.
It definitely is. To really get why this meeting matters so much, we need to remember what's going on in the background with U.S.-Ukraine relations.
Okay.
And of course, that ongoing conflict with Russia.
Right.
The U.S. has been a key ally for Ukraine,
Yeah.
providing tons of financial and military aid.
Right.
But Trump, he's publicly questioned that support, which created a lot of tension and uncertainty.
So help me connect the dots here.
Okay.
What does a tense meeting in the Oval Office have to do with the U.S. economy, inflation, and those interest rates.
Yeah.
I'm starting to see the connections, but it is a lot to process.
You're getting think about it this way. Uncertainty on the world stage, with these international relations,
Yeah.
it can really ripple through global markets. And when investors get nervous, it usually leads to volatility.
Makes sense.
If the situation with Ukraine were to escalate,
Right.
then we could see even more disruptions to those global supply chains,
Okay.
especially for energy and commodities.
And when those supplies get disrupted, prices go up.
Exactly, adding to all those inflationary pressures we've been talking about.
So it's like a chain reaction. One event can set off a whole bunch of consequences that honestly are hard to predict.
Yeah, that's the tricky part and why it's so important to understand these interconnections. You can't just look at everything in isolation.
Yeah,
We have to consider that bigger picture and all the potential ripple effects.
totally agree. Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here, but I feel like we're starting to get a clearer picture of how these seemingly separate news stories are connected.
Yeah, I think so too. It's all starting to come together.
Okay, before we move on to talking about some potential scenarios and what all this means for you, our listener, let's do a quick recap. What are some of the key insights from all of this that are important for us to highlight?
Well, the first thing to remember is that the Fed, they're walking a tightrope right now.
Right.
They're trying to keep that inflation under control, but they're also really worried about accidentally triggering an economic slowdown.
Yeah, if they raise rates too quickly or keep them high for too long.
Exactly, and all their decisions affect everything from mortgage rates to credit card interest, which obviously has a real impact on people's lives.
Totally. And then on top of that, we have those tariffs that are making things even more complex.
Yeah, for sure. They could really drive up prices, especially for big ticket items like cars, and they're creating all kinds of uncertainty for businesses and consumers alike.
Right. And then we also have to remember what's happening on the world stage.
Yeah, the international stuff.
Exactly. Because those geopolitical tensions, like the situation with Ukraine, they can cause all kinds of economic uncertainty, disrupt those supply chains, and ultimately, lead to even more inflation.
It's a lot to keep in mind, for sure.
Yeah, it is a lot to consider, but I think we're starting to get a clearer picture of how these pieces fit together.
Definitely, we're starting to see that bigger picture emerge.
All right, so now let's shift gears a bit and explore some potential scenarios of how all this might play out.
Sounds good.
Stay with us, deep divers, because this is where things get even more interesting.
All right, let's do it. Welcome back. All right, so now that we've kind of laid the groundwork,
Yeah.
let's play a little game of what if, given everything we've talked about.
Okay, I like it.
The Fed tariffs, those international tensions, what are some things that could actually happen?
Okay, let's start with like a best case scenario.
All right.
What if the trade war just kind of simmers down
Okay.
and they lift those tariffs?
Well, in that case, you'd see a lot of businesses breathing a sigh of relief, especially in the auto industry.
Yeah, that makes sense.
We might see car prices stabilize or even, come down a little.
Okay.
And that would definitely help with that overall inflation picture.
Right.
It would give the Fed a little more room to maybe think about lowering those interest rates without worrying about inflation going through the roof.
So lower car prices, potentially lower interest rates on loans. That sounds pretty good to me.
It would be a win for consumers for sure.
But let's be real. Things don't always go the easy way.
Sure.
What if those tariffs stay in place? Or, what if they even get worse?
Well, that's when we start to see some potential downsides for sure.
Okay.
Those trade tensions, if they drag on, it could really slow down global trade, which is never a good thing.
Right.
And we could see prices keep going up, not just for cars, but for lots of other goods too.
Yeah, I could see that.
And if everyone starts, pulling back on spending because everything's so expensive,
Yeah.
that could actually push us into a recession.
Oh, wow. Yeah, a recession is definitely not what anyone wants to hear about.
Nope, not at all.
And I can only imagine that would make the Fed's job even harder.
Oh, absolutely. They'd be in a tough spot, Because on one hand, they want to try and stimulate the economy maybe by lowering rates to encourage people to borrow and spend.
Right.
But then they're also freaking out about inflation getting out of control, especially if those tariffs are still pushing prices up.
It's like they're stuck between a rock and a hard place.
Exactly. It's a real balancing act for sure.
And speaking of things that are balancing precariously, we can't forget about that whole meeting between Trump and Zelenskyy.
Right, the Ukraine situation.
Yeah, how does that factor into all of this economic uncertainty?
That's a huge piece of the puzzle. That whole geopolitical uncertainty, it makes investors really nervous.
Okay.
And that can cause some crazy ups and downs in the stock market.
I've definitely seen that.
If that conflict in Ukraine escalates, it could mean more disruptions to those global supply chains.
Right.
especially for things like energy and commodities.
And we already talked about what happens when those supplies get disrupted.
Exactly. Prices go up, adding to the inflation problem.
It's like this domino effect. One event can trigger a whole chain reaction, and it's hard to know what the consequences will be.
It really is, and that's why it's so important to understand these connections.
Right.
We can't look at these things in isolation.
Right, it's all connected.
Exactly. We've got to think about the bigger picture and all those potential ripple effects.
Okay, so with all of these what-if scenarios swirling around,
Yeah.
what should people be paying attention to in the next few months?
Yeah.
Like, what are some signs that could tell us which way things are going?
I would say keep an eye on those inflation reports.
Oh.
Those numbers will tell you if prices are still going up and how fast.
Right.
And pay attention to what the Fed is saying about interest rates.
Yeah.
Any hints about their future plans could tell us whether they're more worried about inflation or about getting the economy moving.
Okay.
And of course, keep up with the news on that trade war and the situation in Ukraine.
Right.
All of those things could have a big impact on the global economy.
So basically, stay informed.
Yeah, exactly. And don't rely on just one news source or one person's opinion.
Get different perspectives.
Exactly. See what different people are saying. Analyze the information. Be critical. Think for yourself.
I like that.
That's how you stay informed and navigate this crazy world.
Makes sense. This has definitely given me a lot to think about.
Mine too.
It's crazy how these stories that seem totally separate are actually connected in so many ways.
That's what I love about taking a deep dive. You start to see those connections and understand how complex the world really is.
And as overwhelming as it can feel sometimes, I think it's actually really empowering to learn about all of this.
I agree. Knowledge is power,
Yeah.
The more we understand about what's going on, how different events are connected and how they might affect us, the better prepared we are to deal with whatever comes next.
Totally.
Yeah.
All right, deep divers, we're going to take a quick break to gather our thoughts. And when we come back, we'll leave you with some final takeaways and something to think about as you keep following these stories.
Sounds good. We'll be right back.
Okay, so we're back. And, even though this has been a lot of pretty heavy economic stuff,
Yeah, for sure.
I feel like things are starting to make more sense now.
I hope so.
It's like we were putting together a puzzle,
Yeah.
and now we're finally starting to see the whole picture.
Yeah, exactly. And that's the whole point, right? We've been talking about how the Fed's decisions, those trade policies, even things happening on the other side of the world, they're all connected.
Right. We can't just look at things in isolation. It's all one big interconnected system.
Exactly. And I think that's the biggest takeaway here,
Yeah.
that knowledge is power. The more we understand about how the economy works, how things are connected, how those events might affect us, the better prepared we are to deal with all this uncertainty.
I totally agree. It's not about, getting overwhelmed by all the details. It's about having the tools to make sense of it all.
Yeah, and then using that knowledge to make good decisions for yourself.
Exactly. So looking ahead to the coming months, what are some questions that our listeners should be asking themselves, as they follow these stories?
Well, I think it's important to really think about how these events could affect you personally, Like, say you're thinking about buying a car. How would those tariffs or the Fed's interest rates affect your decision? Or if you're worried about your investments, how might that situation in Ukraine affect your strategy?
Those are really good things to think about.
Yeah.
It's about seeing how those big picture issues can actually hit us right here at home.
Exactly. And it's not about, pretending like you have all the answers.
I
It's
see.
about staying curious and informed and asking questions.
And honestly, I think it's also about remembering that even when things feel chaotic and unpredictable, we do have some power to understand it.
Yeah.
We can learn about it and navigate it and make smart choices.
I couldn't agree more. Well, thanks for joining us for this deep dive today.
Yeah, we hope this was helpful and interesting for you.
And hopefully you learned a few things along the way.
We'll be back soon with another topic to explore.
But until then, keep learning and stay curious out there.